From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Mike Oreskes from NPR News in Washington, as we say on the radio.
Yeah.
Our conversation this afternoon is with Lawrence Wright, the New Yorker staff writer and prodigious journalistic polymath. Lawrence Wright is the author of 7 works of nonfiction, 5 plays, 2 screenplays, a novel, and a memoir that I guess captures only maybe the first half of your life between Jack Kennedy and Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
He's also collaborated on 2 documentaries drawn from his works, including most recently, Going Clear, a sharp-eyed look at Scientology. And in case I should forget, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda, and the road to 9/11. So please welcome Lawrence Wright. Larry, welcome. And today we want to at least begin by talking about your most recent book, 13 Days in September. Although I suspect our conversation will lead quite naturally to some of your earlier work and some of the connections between them, which are actually quite fascinating. Today's certainly an excellent day for this conversation. This is the 37th anniversary of the convening of the Camp David peace talks, the subject of your book. Now, the book, more than anything, is really a tale of these 3 leaders and the extraordinary life stories that brought each of them to this moment that shaped history, and you weave those stories in and out of the 13 days at Camp David. Now, 2 of those men, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, are no longer with us, but the 3rd, President Carter, is still very much with us and very much on our mind these days after his deeply moving presence, as he shared with us the sad news of his serious illness. So Larry, I actually thought I'd start with asking you to tell us a little bit about the President Carter that you portray in your book and how he may be different from the President Carter a lot of us probably have in our minds.
It's a good question because I had the same feelings. We actually lived in Atlanta when Carter was governor. And he was a good governor, contentious, prickly, qualities that Americans would soon get to know. But he was a fine man, and what really launched him into the presidential race is that there's a little anecdote, if you don't mind my telling it. He lost his first race for governor to Lester Maddox, one of the most racist figures in Georgia's history, and Lester had made a name for himself by chasing black people out of his restaurant with an axe handle and a pistol. And his other distinguishing quality is he could ride a bicycle backward, which apparently qualified you for high office in Georgia at the time. And Jimmy Carter lost to this man. And that was when he went into this terrible fit of depression and had his reborn experience. His biggest supporter in Georgia at the time was an Iranian Jew who lived in Savannah, a businessman, and David Parham. And he was a pilot. And in addition to giving Carter money, he flew him around to make these speeches around the state. And they spent so much time in the airplane that Carter learned how to fly while David took naps. And one night, Carter was flying and David was napping, and the engine sputtered and died. And so he nudges David, David, wake up, David, wake up, what happened? We're out of gas. And so he said, well, then we're going to crash. And he just let that sit for a moment, and then he reached down and turned on the spare gas tank. So not a lot of people tease Jimmy Carter. And so this testifies to their relationship. And anyway, when Carter recovered his good sense of humor, he said, David, the campaign is near an end. And it appears I will be successful. And you've been my biggest supporter. I just want to know, what can I do for you? And he said, Jimmy, I don't need anything that you can give me. There's only one thing I would ask. I wish you would do something to relieve the burden of racial hatred that has weighed this state down for so long. And so Carter reached into the glove compartment, or whatever you call it on an airplane, And there was a flight map, and he wrote, "I say to you, the time for racial discrimination is over." And he showed it to Parham, and he said, "If I am elected, I will say this on my inauguration day." And he said, "Sign it." So Carter signed it, and he said it, and that got him on the cover of Time magazine. And it's a statement that testifies how unusual such a sentiment would be in the Deep South at the time, that the whole country would take notice of a Southern politician who had the nerve to say something that now seems, almost meaningless. But it was a very courageous statement.
And that was when he first became governor of Georgia.
He became governor, and so and he ran for president more or less as Jimmy Who, because nobody really knew him. And I think that the Americans voted for him in an act of contrition after Nixon, and then found themselves stuck with this rather pious, inflexible micromanager. And that's the way I pictured him too. So, but the man that went to Camp David was a different individual than the one that I thought I understood. I went down to Plains with Gerald Rafshoon, who this whole project began as a play here in Washington at the Arena stage. And so I went down to meet the Carters and try to get a sense of who he was. They live in an incredibly modest house that when he resigned from the Navy to go back and take over the family peanut business, which was broke, they built this little ranch-style house, and they still live in it. And they sat on this blue chintz couch with matching blue curtains, and behind us, over the couch, was a painting that Jimmy had done of the room we were sitting in, which looked exactly like an illustration from Goodnight Moon. I'm telling you, all that was missing was a red balloon. And I was very taken with the Carters. At the time, I was looking to see who was going to be on stage. I knew Carter, Begin, and Sadat, but would there be any other characters in the play? And Jerry Rafshoon introduced me by saying, "Mr. President, Larry works for the New Yorker, and he just wrote an article about Scientology." And Carter said, "Oh, I read that. I found it most intriguing." And Rosalind turned to him and said, "Since when did you start reading the New Yorker?" And I thought, I found my fourth character. I needed somebody who could talk to Jimmy Carter like that. And Rosalind Carter was born in the house next door to Jimmy. And they've known each other for almost a century. And yet they still have this rather vital, beautiful relationship.
And she does play a crucial role during those 13 days.
Camp David was her idea. So it was more than, just facilitating. Carter was trying to find a way to bring these Middle East leaders together. And he was very despondent about who he had to work with, until he met Anwar Sadat, and he just fell head over heels for him. But he didn't know exactly how to go about managing the inevitable leaks and flow of information. And Rosalind said, "Just bring him to Camp David." And so in many ways, Camp David, she's the unacknowledged author of it. While we were in Plains, I had read in her memoir that she had kept a journal during Camp David. 200 typewritten pages, she said. And so I said, "Mrs. Carter, I sure would like to have a look at that diary." And, "Oh, it's around here somewhere." Absolutely no effort to find it. And so I went to the Carter Library and asked, and she has a diary? It was unknown, and I kept pressuring Rafshoon, and finally he called the president, and one day a manila envelope arrived with all these typewritten pages, and so I went through it, and there was a lot of, to trace the emotional course of those tumultuous 13 days. It was a very valuable document, and I highlighted what was useful to me and made some notes. And then a month later, Rafshun calls me and says, "Larry, what'd you do with that diary? Rosalind wants it back. It's her only copy." So I had to write a very difficult letter.
So go back in the tale one stage, though, to you and Jerry Rafshun, who, of course, was a key aide to Jimmy Carter. What was his goal in getting you to write the play in the first place, and what turned the play ultimately into this book?
Well, you know, Jerry had a dream of making a movie about Camp David. He's a movie producer, right. and yet it never actually happened. And so the Arena, which I want to say is just a wonderful institution. You are so blessed in this city to have such a great theater, and it's making such an impact. There's so many plays originate out of here and go to New York. It's just great. And they've been doing a series on the American presidency. And so this seemed to fit. And so Jerry went to them, and they decided to commission a play on Carter, and I was approached, and because we had lived in Atlanta, and my wife and I actually lived in Egypt and taught at the American University when Anwar Sadat became president. So I'd been to Israel a number of times as a reporter. So I felt that I knew the territory, but while I was researching, I was surprised to find that there really wasn't a general interest book about Camp David, one of the great triumphs of diplomatic history. And William Quandt, who was in the National Security Council, had written a very scholarly book about it. And there were some books in Arabic. I went to Israel and Egypt and talked to the surviving members of those delegations. And, you know, there's a lot of material out there, but it just had not been put into a book. And so it's unusual. Usually, you know, you might base a play on a book or a movie or something like that, but in this case, the play came first.
Fascinating. So now tell us about these other two key characters, Sadat and Begin. They're a bit unlikely, too, in this play.
Well, you know, I look back at how impossible it was to have achieved what was achieved at Camp David. You know, Carter was a weak and unpopular president. And, you know, the crime rate was at 20%. Some people here I can see are old enough to remember the stagflation and the gas lines, and you know it was a really difficult. The Shah was going down. There was, you know, it was a terrible moment, and Carter was deeply unpopular. And then he brings together two other guys, and Jerry Rafshun likes to say his pitch when he came to me was when a born-again Christian, an Orthodox Jew, and a pious Muslim go behind closed doors for 13 days and come out with the only durable treaty in the Middle East. Well, there was a lot of truth in that. And yet, behind that kind of nice story, there is, in the case of Anwar Sadat, for instance, he was a man who conceived of himself from an early age as having a date with destiny. It was I don't know, but it was a premonition or a complete illusion. When he was 12 years old, Gandhi was going through the Suez Canal on his way to England to negotiate the future of India, and that this small brown man could topple an empire made a huge impression on little Anwar Sadat. And so he took off his clothes and started dressing in an apron and made a spindle for himself, you know, in imitating Gandhi. But he also adored Adolf Hitler, which wasn't entirely anomalous in Egypt at the time, which was occupied by Britain. And so Britain's enemy was Germany, and a lot of Egyptians felt a kinship. And he actually tried to negotiate some alliance with Rommel. He was a captain in the Signal Corps, but he conspired with a couple of Nazi spies, and then he also joined what he called the Assassination Society, which was a group of people that mainly they killed British soldiers who were maybe drunk and wandering around at night by themselves. But he raised their sights to try to kill the prime minister. They did succeed in killing a government minister, and he went to prison for about 5 years before he escaped. So he was a Nazi collaborator and an assassin. We can look at him in many other ways. He was an idealist, and he had a great vision of peace. I remember when he became president, people in Egypt thought he was a joke. Gamal Abdel Nasser had been this titanic figure, and then suddenly he dies of a heart attack. And the vice president, just to put it in American, it would be like Dan Quayle suddenly had become president, and people would have to make an adjustment in their thinking, But within a few years, he had just turned the world upside down. There were no diplomatic relations between our two countries. And when we lived there were practically no Americans, but many, many Russians, thousands of Russians. And he expelled them for no reason that we could figure out. One of America's greatest victories in the Cold War. And then one day he's speaking to the Egyptian parliament, and he puts down his long-winded speech, and he says, if I would go anywhere, to the ends of the earth, I would even go to Jerusalem in Israel and speak to their parliament, the Knesset, if it would spare one more Egyptian life. And everybody applauded. Nobody believed it. It wasn't even published in the papers. But 10 days later, his plane is circling Ben Gurion Airport. And if you can propel yourself into this was Israel's most formidable enemy, the only Arab country that posed a genuine threat to the existence of the state of Israel. And here, unbidden, is the leader of that country coming ostensibly to make peace. And is it really true? They weren't totally certain he was in the plane. There was a fear that there were terrorists in the plane, or it was full of explosives. Ben Gurion Airport was filled with, surrounded by snipers just in case. And the floodlight, it was just after sundown and after the close of Shabbat, and floodlights catch the plane, and the whole country is in a state of delirium. And can it be true? And then his plane lands, and Sadat comes down, and he greets Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, all of the most feared figures in the Arab imagination. And this was his idea, that he would come make this gesture. He would recognize Israel's existence, which carried a lot of weight emotionally at the time, although it was a nonsensical idea in many ways. And then they would give him, in return, they'd give him back to Sinai, and they would have peace.
Now, his counterpart, Menachem Begin, he did have one thing in common with Sadat, which is they both came of age killing British soldiers.
Well, that was the reason he didn't go home with the peace that he expected. Menachem Begin he grew up in a little Polish town called Brest. And his first memory was of Polish soldiers flogging a Jew. When the Nazis invaded, Begin's mother was in the hospital with pneumonia, and the Nazis went through the hospital and murdered the patients in their beds. His father was taken to the river Bug. His pockets were filled with rocks, and he was tied up and thrown in and drowned in the river. And Menachem was actually in hiding at the time in Lithuania, and then spent several years in the gulags, Stalin's Russia, until Stalin freed the Poles to fight against the Nazis. And the unit that Begin joined went to Palestine. And there he became the head of Irgun, which was a terrorist organization that was at the time waging war against Great Britain, which was waging war against Nazi Germany. You can imagine how conflictual that was for most of the Jewish population. But Begin was an incredibly imaginative and energetic terrorist. And his campaign went on, multiple attacks day after day after day with a great eye toward publicity. When the British hanged 3 convicted terrorists, Begin's group, for instance, hanged several British sergeants and then booby-trapped their bodies. His group blew up the King David Hotel, which was at the time the most luxurious hotel in the Middle East. But one part of it served as a headquarters for the British Mandate, and 90 people were killed. And effectively, he drove the British out of Palestine. And when they left, he turned his attention to the Palestinians. There was a little village called Deir Yassin, which is just outside Jerusalem. And it was a peaceful village. They'd actually made an agreement with their ultra-Orthodox neighbors in the village next door, so they had no incidents there. But Begin believed that it stood above an access road to Jerusalem and it had to be taken. So his men went through that town, throwing hand grenades through the windows, blowing up houses. 20 men who survived were taken to a quarry and shot. Women and children afterwards were put on a flatbed truck and paraded through Jerusalem. It was a massacre. And there had been Palestinians who were leaving before that. But after Deir Yassin, 700,000 of them left. And Begin bore a considerable moral responsibility for that. So these were the men who came to Camp David. Yeah. You think about no perfect partner for peace, but when you really look at but one thing they had in common, they all had a great amount of political courage.
And is it that courage that ultimately allowed them to achieve a deal? What was the secret that got them to a deal?
Well, there was different chemistry at work for all 3 of them. And Sadat came to Camp David thinking that even if I don't make peace with Israel, maybe I can supplant Israel as America's favorite friend in the Middle East. Because he and Carter really were very close. And whereas Carter and Begin had no chemistry at all. And so Sadat actually said, whatever you say, I will sign, which wasn't really true, but it was he invested this tremendous amount of faith in Carter. And Begin, on the other hand, just to say one more thing about Sadat, he was the only person in his delegation that was at all interested in peace. Everybody else was against it. So he was surrounded by people who were angry at him, and so angry that one night Carter woke up fearing that Sadat was going to be murdered by his own delegation at Camp David. And so he called Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor. And so at 4 in the morning, Brzezinski's out in his pajamas trying to get the Secret Service detail to reinforce the security around Sadat's cabin to protect him from his own people. Begin was in exactly the opposite situation. Everybody in his delegation wanted peace more than he did. And he was the most obstinate member of the delegation. And he seemed to be constantly looking for a way out. He only expected to be there for a few days and that they would have some sort of agree to continue to talk, sort of. And Carter said, no, our goal is to walk away with peace. And I don't think Begin really ever imagined that it would be laid on the line like that. And it was, this 13 days of just a huge roller coaster of emotions. There was, despair and exuberation, every day. But the last day, the 13th day, Carter had it in the bag. They had agreed to every detail, and the networks had been alerted that the president was going to interrupt the Emmys, as it happened. They were setting up the East Room of the White House, and Carter had signed a side letter for the Accords. It has nothing to do with the Accords. These kinds of Accords are always decorated with "we agree to disagree" type letters. And this particular letter was about Jerusalem. So on that 13th day, Begin read the letter, and he said, what the letter said was that we was restating American policy of the last 4 administrations, that Jerusalem is occupied territory. This is still to today America's position. And he said, if you don't withdraw this, I will call off the signing. And Carter said, I promised Sadat I'd provide this. And so in that case, the talks were off. And Carter went back to his cabin the most despondent he had ever been. It was not only, the talks were not only a failure, they were now a fiasco. And Begin had asked for photographs to give to his grandchildren, his 8 grandchildren, of the 3 men, sitting on the porch negotiating. And so Carter's secretary, Susan Clow, had thoughtfully called Jerusalem and gotten the names of those 8 grandchildren. So Carter had inscribed each of them and then signed it, "Love, Jimmy Carter." And so he came back from Begin's cabin, and Rosalind gave him the envelope with the photographs in it. And I don't think I can, he never wanted to see Menachem Begin again. And but he had to do it. So he walked back to Begin's cabin, and Begin received him very frostily. And Carter said, I just came to say goodbye, and Begin said goodbye. And then Carter handed him the photographs and said, you had asked for these. And so Begin looks in there, and he sees that the first one is inscribed to his granddaughter Michal, and then his grandson Yonatan. And he reads out the names, and he begins to weep. And Carter also burst into tears. And he said, I had hoped to write, "This is where your grandfather and I made peace in the Middle East." And then he went back to his cabin to call Sadat and tell him the talks were off. And the phone rang, and Begin said he would sign.
So they succeeded in signing a peace between Israel and Egypt. But in another sense, they fell far short of the ambition that Jimmy Carter took up to Camp David.
Right.
And we've been living with that failure ever since.
There are 2 parts to the Camp David Accords. One part is the peace between Egypt and Israel, and as you mentioned 37 years ago, there hasn't been a single violation of that. And if you spend a lot of time in the Middle East, as I have, one lesson you draw is things can always get worse. But just think how much worse they would be if Israel and Egypt were still at war, as they had been for 4 times in the course of 20 years. So the other part of the Accords is a prospective peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And every effort that we've made to accomplish that peace has been an attempt to realize the dream that was in that second part of the Accords. Carter always felt that Begin lied to him. That last Saturday night, it was late, they should not have been perhaps negotiating for so long a period of time. Everybody was sleepy and tired, but Carter thought that he got Begin to agree that there would be no more settlement construction until the Palestinian portion of the accord was agreed to by the Palestinians, and they moved forward on that. And Begin said that could be as long as 5 years. And he said, well, you have an incentive, you know, to, well, that didn't happen. You know, there was settlement building almost by the time Begin's plane landed. And the Israelis say that never happened, that Begin never agreed to that. And it does seem far-fetched, given who Begin was, that he would agree to it. But Carter and Memory and Cy Vance, his Secretary of State, who was present, they both felt very strongly that they had gotten that verbal pledge. And in evidence that there might be some, you know, twice Carter asked for a letter stating what Begin had promised, and they gave him a letter that said something different.
Now, when the play opened, you said, I guess, at the premiere that you really hoped that this work you've done on Camp David would, quote, inform the Washington political culture, by which I assume you mean our tremendously dysfunctional present-day political culture. So here you are back in Washington. What is it you want to be drawn from this story? What's the lesson for present-day Washington?
Well, you know, Mike, here we are in a moment that is, in some respects, has echoes of Camp David. You know, this deal with Iran is promising. You know, we all have our fingers crossed, no matter which side you are. But think how rare it is. War is really common, but making peace is really unusual and rare and extremely difficult. That's why it's so infrequently accomplished. And look at how hard it's been to do this. And the amount of political capital that has been expended. And you know, the blame that is sometimes heaped on the peacemakers themselves is, I think, inexcusable. Whatever you think of the deal, the fact is that making peace, having entities, whether they're states or different kinds of entities, come to the table and agree on something is a huge step forward and much better. And no matter what comes out of this, it's going to be better than a war.
Now, I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause for 1 second. As much as we like hearing ourselves talk, we do want to invite you to join our microphones on either side. So if you'll come up to the microphones, I will call on you. I want to ask one question, though, about something that fascinates me, and I think since everyone in this room lived through some version of the attacks of 9/11, there's a moment, a footnote actually, in 13 Days that ties directly back to your book on the 9/11 attacks. And it's a footnote that describes the reading material that Al-Qaeda had that included Menachem Begin's memoir. Could you just tell us a little bit about that connection?
American troops, when they went into bin Laden's Afghan compound, they found some books, and one of them was Revolt, Begin's first memoir. And one can look at it as a kind of... Bruce Hoffman, who teaches here at Georgetown, is a great scholar of terrorism, and it's his belief that bin Laden was looking at it as a way of trying to transition from being a terrorist chieftain to a statesman, and that he might have modeled or tried to model himself on that.
Fascinating. Let's come over here for a question.
This is a digression, but I won't be here tonight. It would be a more appropriate question. Your book on Scientology. I was wondering if there's in the works a big Hollywood movie, and if so, who would you like to play David Miscavige, and would Tom Cruise and John Travolta play themselves?
Fortunately, I'm not involved in the casting of such a thing, but I did think at one point, and I still am toying with the idea of doing a series on it. I'm interested in the culture of, religious groups, and why people believe one thing or another, and how people can be led to do things that they would never conceive of themselves of doing, were it not for this body of beliefs that takes people down these various paths.
When you look at your body of work, there is a bit of a thread that runs through all of this. And when you were working on the Scientology book, was the connection between that kind of obsessive religion and the obsessive religion of Islamic fundamentalism, did those two thoughts connect for you in some way?
Well, I'm not going to compare them as being, but they are, let's say that they're full of idealists. And there's a common thread. Even ISIS, as loathsome as it is, these people think that they're bringing on the apocalypse and the end of days, and that this is a great thing. And and you know, if you were to sit down and talk to them, you would probably find that they're full of, you know, the spirit of religious fervor, and they feel like they're doing the right thing. And that leads them to do the worst things imaginable.
Let's come over here.
I read your book several months ago. I thought it was just intriguing and fascinating. And
Thank you.
what an intimate portrait of those people. I don't know how you did it. It was just remarkable. But do you think Sadat knew he was going to, did he have a fatalistic view when he left? And does that hold any lessons for the future? We're negotiating with Iranian people, moderates perhaps, we're trying to negotiate with Palestinians. I mean, is there a fear of retribution? Did Sadat have that premonition?
You know, I asked his wife that, Jihan Sadat, because I always felt that he must have had that premonition. And everybody, I mean, he had 3 foreign ministers resign from him. He was widely hated and for signing the Camp David Accords. But she said no, that, and even the day he died, he refused to wear his armored vest because it would spoil the lines of his tailored uniform. He was one time given an award as the best dressed man in the world.
He was of course assassinated that day by other Egyptians.
Yes, and so I take her word for it that he seemed impervious to that.
Sorry, going back to Looming Tower, which I finished quite a time ago. Really great book, by the way.
Thank you.
You mentioned a couple of interesting sort of anecdotes. One, the discrepancy in Bin Laden's heights, and other, the Turki Al-Faisal incident where he may or may not have given the Americans the names of certain hijackers. I was curious how you went about fact-checking and sort of trying to reconcile different versions when you were going about your writing in Looming Tower in 13 Days and other books.
Well, thank you. I love talking about fact-checking and stuff like that. In Looming Tower, my main sources were intelligence agents and terrorists, and they're not altogether reliable.
Who's more reliable?
Well, I try to intimidate my sources, and this is how I do it. I write down, I have a legal pad, and I write down all these names of people that I want to talk to. And when I, you know, on that little 1.5 inch side, I put down their telephone numbers and so on. And then when I talk to them, I highlight. And in the Looming Tower, you know, there are 27 lines on that, and there are 50 pages, and I had 1.5 legal pads full of names, and I had different color highlighter because I found out the FBI agents thought that it was a code. And so this is like pixie dust, you know. So when I'm talking to people, I always say, who else should I talk to? And I would slowly go through this list of names and watch their faces drop, and then think maybe I better tell you something else that I might correct myself, you know. And there are documents that you can call upon, and if you find an inconsistency, you go back to a source. So I think of horizontal and vertical reporting. I talked to about 600 people in Looming Tower, and that's, you know, the first rule of journalism, you try to talk to everybody, and that's the universe of people that would talk to me. But there's another axis, which is certain people are just more informed, more candid, more amusing, more available, and you go back to them again and again, especially when you're actually writing, because, the questions that you didn't think of at the time occur to you when you're writing. So sometimes there were people I talked to probably 100 times. And it's that continual inquiry that that helps you give some idea that you're getting close to what might be the truth.
Maybe as moderator's privilege, I will say that of all the millions of words that have been spilled over the 9/11 attacks, there are really only two that are essential. One is the report of the Commission on 9/11, and the other is Looming Towers.
Oh, thank you, Mike.
If you read nothing else, those two are crucial. One of the questions that actually I had in my mind as I read Looming Tower long ago, and then more recently as I read 13 Days, kind of goes like this. If you read the final commission of the 9/11, the final report of the 9/11 Commission, and then you read Looming Tower, you come away quite convinced, or at least quite aware of the fact that the 9/11 attacks certainly could have been prevented and maybe should have been prevented. And then when I read 13 Days, I came away with a similar but more amorphous feeling that if Jimmy Carter had been able to achieve the full ambitions at Camp David, perhaps again 9/11 would not have occurred.
Well, certainly he believed that if he had a second term, he could have enforced the Palestinian portion of that accord, and it might be true. And if you were to take the Israeli-Palestinian dilemma out of it would certainly have diminished the antagonism. And it's not as if the countries, the Arab countries around there have been actively helping the Palestinians. Not far from it, right. And yet the Palestinians have constantly been used as an excuse for radical Islam. And if you could have withdrawn that excuse, it would have been more difficult, I think, to justify the attacks of 9/11. There might have been others that other justifications that might have been employed, but even for its own sake, this is a very dangerous contest. And in my opinion, we go from periods of extreme crisis to periods of complacency, and that's the place we're in now. But we will be moving again into extreme crisis, and I hope that the Iran deal will turn out to make Israel safer. But that's not the only enemy that Israel has in that region. And with the kinds of weapons and stuff like that and when you're in the Middle East, you realize how small it is, how intimate, and how from like here you could be, if this were a cafe in Damascus, Israel would be at the reservoir. It's just over the hill, and it's just not that far away. And the amount of damage that can be done by close-in neighbors like that is very difficult to manage.
We've used up our time. I want to thank all of you, and especially thank Lawrence Wright. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.